Thanks everybody for being here tonight. We're very happy and honored with the presence of Christopher Hitchens and Arato tonight here, Stacy McGoldrick, and myself. I'm going to speak slowly, although briefly, because because I'm jet lagged, like everybody else here on the table. Coming from Morocco, Christopher Hitchens, New York, Arato. I just came back from India, and Stacy from Pomona. And many of my students here from Valencia and some other people, LA is the only place on earth that you can get jet lagged by driving. You know? So let me start by referring to how Stacy McGoldrick and myself, former fellow PhD students at the New School for Social Research, we both had the good luck of meeting these two scholars and public intellectuals, Arato and Christopher Hitchens at the New School. Although Stacy will present the speakers in a few minutes in a more careful fashion, I want to anticipate that one of the reasons why we are truly happy to have them here tonight is because I think, if I'm not wrong, both their intellectual practice and scholarship embody what the School of Critical Studies at CalArts believes critical discourse should and can be. And moreover, because their presence here today marks, I'm sure, one of the highest points of REDCAT's contribution to the revitalization of the public space in downtown Los Angeles. But I want to introduce today's panel by making a reference to another public intellectual and scholar and political thinker, the political thinker that made me go to the New School for Social Research in the first place. Her name was Hannah Arendt. And the reason I'm referring to her is not only because it's one of the many other common things between those of us here today, but because I will use only the first notion of her that inspired me. It was her notion of action. And for Arendt, to put it simply, action was the human capacity to begin something new, to start processes that, although initiated by individuals or groups, nobody, particularly not those individuals or groups, can really know for sure what outcomes those actions will have. And this is due to the fact that their meaning and their effects are beyond the actor's control and are constituted by the action's inscription in what Hannah Arendt called the web of relationships and enacted stories characteristic of human plurality. So the reason why I think action is important here, because the Bush administration in particular, but also many others, often claims that 9/11 has changed everything by saying so. They are in fact, I think, attributing to the 19 hijackers' actions the power of having changed the world. If this were true, however, it would mean that the dominant characteristic of our time, both domestically and internationally, would still be the continuation of the global sympathy for the victims and solidarity with the American-led actions in Afghanistan that dominated the immediate aftermath of the massacre. However, this doesn't seem to be the world in which we live today. And the reason might be that it has actually been the invasion of Iraq and not 9/11 what has inaugurated the domestic and international situation in which we find ourselves today. What has invading Iraq actually done? How was and still is the invasion justified? Keeping in mind, of course, that internationally these justifications at the time didn't persuade the actors and institutions that had to be persuaded. What implications have these actions and justifications had for Iraq, America, and the world? We are meeting here today right after the 3rd anniversary of the invasion. Although it seems clear that for the war planners, we should have by now been able to exercise our retrospective judgment on the war for a long time already. The war should have been over for a while. The conflict is nonetheless still unfolding, and we shouldn't really use the past tense yet. However, this might be also the time to start analyzing the events with a comparatively more detached view of the political thinker, the historian, and the critic, than with a way too self-interested discourse of political actors. It is the time, I think, Stacy and I believe, to seriously start contributing to telling the story that sometime in the future will hopefully tell us what was all this about. So I want to thank you all again for having come tonight and for contributing to our goal of instituting here at REDCAT a space for critical analysis of the major events of our time. I now pass the microphone to Stacy McGoldrick, a friend, close friend, that's why I only know Stacy, ex-fellow PhD student of mine and assistant professor at Cal Poly Pomona.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for coming this evening. I have two tasks that I will do very briefly. First, I am to tell you who these people are, but most of you already know that, so that's pretty easy. And second, I am to tell you why Martín and I were so keen to get these men together, who actually have not met before today, even though they were both at the New School at the same time. So Andrew Arato is a professor of political and social theory at the graduate faculty at the New School for Social Research. He's a well-known scholar of the Frankfurt School in critical theory. He has written about democracy and civil society. He's written several articles in publications like Dissent and the New Left Review. He's also one of the editors of the Journal of Political Theory Constellations. About this situation in Iraq, in particular, some of his noted articles are called Sistani versus Bush, Constitutional Politics in Iraq, The Occupation of Iraq and the Difficult Transition from Dictatorship, and Civil Society, Constitution, and Legitimacy. Christopher Hitchens is a well-known public intellectual and writer. He has written in too many magazines for me to list, and has written, I think, 15 books, I counted on the CV. He writes about everything from literature to travel, American culture, religion, and of course, politics. He has written countless articles about Iraq and the war on terrorism, and he's also recently published a book called A Long Short War, The Postponed Liberation of Iraq. So those are who they are. But I also want to explain why they're here together. I have to be a little biographical to do this explanation, so I hope you'll bear with me a moment. I recently moved to Pomona. I live in Pomona. I'm proud of it. I recently moved to Pomona to teach at Cal Poly Pomona. And when I got out here, I was very happy that my friend Martín was already living here and teaching at CalArts. And we immediately, as soon as he came back from France, we got together and we just started talking about, we're here, what can we do? And we were talking about the politics of the day. And we were thinking about, could we put something together? What was pressing for us in terms of talking about what's happening today? And immediately our fantasy, like other people's fantasy baseball teams or something, was, was to get these men together to talk about it. This is who we wanted to have a conversation, or wanted to hear their conversation. The reason, fundamentally, is the fact that these two men have had on both of our young scholarship life. Andrew Arato was on both of our dissertation committees. I don't know what Martín's experience was, but I was most afraid of Andrew at my dissertation defense, and which, by the way, he thought I had not properly formulated my idea of the state, and I'm trying to work on it. Christopher Hitchens, I first met when I was sitting in on a class of his where he discussed English and American literature and thought, and I was fascinated by him and pressed him to mentor me and talk to me and engage in political discussions with me, and he was always very generous and has been incredibly influential to how I approach my own scholarship, even though I often disagree. But more, just to give you an example of how important these men have been to us, I think I have to talk for a minute about the days right after September 11th. We were, Andrew, Martín, and I were all in New York. And in the days, Martín and I were just talking about this, in the days right after September 11th, so there's warplanes and fire and smoke and chaos and fear all around us. And Martín and I have very distinct memories of it on 2 separate occasions crowding into a tiny seminar room to hear what Andrew had to say about it. That's where we went to help interpret this new reality. We went to Andrew. We wanted to know what he thought about it. Similarly, Martín didn't know Christopher then, but I was furiously corresponding with him about what this meant, what was going to happen now. And he very compassionately, although never shirking away from the seriousness of the calamity, spent time talking about it with me. So we thought, considering that on this 3rd anniversary, it would be good to go back to the men that had been so important to us and ask them what they think now. So, thank you.
The format of the event will be Arato first and Christopher Hitchens second. Will talk for about 15 minutes each of them. They're going to have a series of questions that we put together with Stacy, and we're going to formulate the questions alternatively to each of them. And then we're going to have open floor for all of you. I'm really looking forward to your questions on this. So thanks.
What's the outer limit of the discussion?
The final minute?
When are you going to call it quits?
10, I know. Let's see, 10:30? 10:15? Is it fine? Let's see how it goes.
All right.
So, Arato.
Okay. Right, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and I very much appreciate being able to participate in this discussion. So I will do what I was asked and try to stay within the 15 minutes. So on this 3rd anniversary then, imagine a gigantic balance seeking to evaluate the pros and cons, the pluses and minuses of America's adventure in Iraq. On the one side, the negative one. This is, of course, my interpretation. There is the clear and indisputable illegality of the war. The fact that for a signatory, for the major signatory of the UN Charter, that there could be another kind of war than either Article 51 or Chapter 7, that it could fight an aggressive war that was a crime under the Charter, is certainly on the negative side. But of course, law is not everything, and people have argued that sometimes in the name of political legitimacy, a higher political legitimacy, the law can be violated. But I think legitimacy too is on the negative side, because in a modern world, with the end of meta-historical and metaphysical guarantees, outside of legality, there is no other legitimacy than democracy. And there is no democratic legitimacy for this war, which had neither public support in most of the countries, and in the country where it had tepid public support in this country, it had it on the basis of lies. The population wasn't told why the war was fought, and the reasons that it were given were based on misrepresentations that everyone later on found out to be such. From an international point of view, there was no democracy either. You could say that even if the Security Council did not, under Chapter 7, authorize the war, there could have been at least a moral majority of the Security Council members voting for it, but there was not. Only 5 members of the Council would have supported the war. If the Iraqis would have really welcomed the American invaders, there would have been at least that kind of democratic legitimacy, but there was precious little also of that kind of welcome, and public opinion polls in Iraq never demonstrated wide support for the American invasion. So that much for legitimacy. Beyond illegality and legitimacy, there's also the problem of rationality. From the point of view of the regional balance, from the point of view of the war against terror, from the point of view of the problem of nuclear proliferation, this war was a deeply irrational one. From the point of view of regional balance, everyone who understood these things and wrote about it knew that the destruction of Saddam's Sunni-dominated state is going to create a regional balance that Iran will dominate. This was foretold by many people, including even me, during the beginning of the war. As far as the war against terror, it was assumed that whether or not there were connections, and it was not known in the beginning if there were or were not, between Al-Qaeda and Saddam, this kind of war will create more terrorists than ever is going to be able to kill. As far as the incentive to go nuclear, to the extent that Saddam did not have nuclear weapons and no one assumed that he could have anything resembling them, the lesson the war against Iraq proved is that countries must go nuclear if they want to avoid being invaded. Think of the contrast between North Korea and Iraq. So that's that much for the rationality of the war. And on the negative side, I would also throw in, but I'm just going to throw it in now because I need to rush, the effects on the US political process, which were negative, and the effects on our civil liberties, which together with what were already the policies of the US government in formation, were also negative. There's another side, the positive side. The liberation of Iraq from an oppressive dictatorship, one that was not going to easily go away, given its military capacities and its financial resources, is certainly a plus. The release of political energies, elections, parties, mass actions, constitutional politics, 2 constitutions were written, a constitutional politics that is still going on, and we can talk about that in the discussion if you want, is certainly on the plus side as well. Which side outweighs which? Assuming my picture, the answer for a non-Iraqi will most likely be the negative. How could it be otherwise? Logically, one might think an Iraqi, except for the direct beneficiaries of the old regime, would insist on the positive. I'm afraid that at least today, and I don't know about the surveys exactly at the time of the war, with the exception of the Kurds, few Iraqis would actually say today that it was worth it from their point of view. But this may be too short a range look from the point of view of a very chaotic situation. It may be wrong, in other words, that liberation was nothing more than a self-serving occupation. It may be wrong, too, that the political process would have turned out to be a failure. It may also turn out to be wrong that the 2 constitutions were not solutions of societal divisions, but were their exacerbations. Iraqis today actually feel these things, at least the majority tends to. The liberation was only an occupation, the political process a failure, the constitutions are no good and solve no problems, but they could be wrong. What we need to explore, however, is what has happened between then and now, and whether their suspicions are right or wrong. And if their suspicions are right, was it inevitable that a thing that had some things on the positive side of the ledger should turn out the way it has? Now, I must admit, I was never for a moment for this war. But once Saddam was overthrown, among my friends, I was one of the people who thought that, at least in itself, other things being equal, that's a good thing, and one should at least try to make a contribution, whatever one can, to a democratic development, that in spite of everything, in spite of initial illegality and illegitimacy and irrationality, that something like the window of opportunity for democracy in Iraq be exploited. I try to do this, but we don't have to talk about this now, through trying to make a small contribution to discussions around the UNDP, hoping that the United Nations at least could make at a certain juncture some kind of positive input into the process. I turn out to be wrong about that, but that doesn't matter now. Theoretically, what I thought, and here I use Hannah Arendt's work to help me, was that one could distinguish between liberation, which is an act of force, and a constitution, and substitute for many of the traditional liberating forces of the past an external agency that, to be sure, will be perhaps considered an occupier by some of the people of the country, but nevertheless would have at least some advantages in relationship to an indigenous elite in setting up a constitutional process. For example, it would not have to use its power position to establish a long-term set of advantages for incumbents of its own choice. It could remain relatively neutral in inner Iraqi conflicts and controversies. I mean, we have seen this, for example, in post-war Germany, where the American occupation authority was relatively neutral in relationship to the conflicts between social democrats and Christian democrats, and so on. I also imagined that one could imitate recent efforts at constitution making in divided societies. I was especially impressed by the efforts that were undertaken in the Republic of South Africa, whose process I thought really had a model character. Now, of course, what has happened under American occupation was, now we can all see it, was not comparable to a process like that of South Africa. And perhaps I was laboring under many illusions when I thought any kind of comparison like that could be made, given the role of a foreign agency. But 8 facts, and I will just mention them very quickly, were significantly different and significantly negative about the process as it took place in Iraq. And some of this have been stressed by other interpreters, but in my defense, at least, I can say that I stressed almost all of them from the beginning of my writings on the subject. The first was the destruction of the Iraqi state, the army, and the state apparatus, which the American occupiers began almost from the beginning, but certainly completed once Jay Gardner was replaced by Paul Bremer as the American Viceroy of Iraq. The second was the failure to rapidly organize elected local government. Here again, Gardner's tentative efforts were reversed by Bremer when he took over. Third, the failure to internationalize the monitoring of the political process a la Afghanistan. There was really never an attempt to accomplish this. Fourth, the creation of an exclusionary and ethnicized structure of an interim government, which made the exclusion of a very significant part of the population a problem down to today. I mean by this the Sunni Arab part of the population, which was almost wholly, but not completely excluded from the process, at least in terms of important political organization. Fifthly, the making of a state bargain exclusively with one group, namely the Kurds. Sixthly, the creation of an interim constitution which froze the subsequent political process in a very negative way. Seventhly, the attempt to broaden inclusion much too late, leading to sharp conflicts. Here, the problem of sequencing was extremely serious. And finally, the toleration of illegalities, irregularities all along the process, especially, of course, one's own, the occupying authorities' own military forces, but in the last phase, in a kind of faithful way on the part of the Iraqi authorities themselves. Now, people ask about what was the original sin of the Iraqi process, and of course, one answer that one could give, one that I certainly don't want to dismiss, and perhaps I'll return to it again in this discussion, is the war itself. But as I said, in all my analysis, I always try to raise the question whether in spite of the war something could not have been done, and then the question is, well, where did the process go wrong, if not with the war itself? And there are, and in the long list that I have just given you, there are two candidates for this. One, and they amount to the same thing. One candidate is the destruction of the state. If the Iraqi state would have been kept more or less intact, or at least only if part of it had been dismantled, if the state apparatus would have been kept, even if the army would have been partially dismantled, or the other way around. Either way, the creation of the forcing of the whole Sunni professional middle class into an antagonistic position to the whole process would not have occurred quite to the same extent. And if that would not have happened, then in the bargaining and negotiating process, Sunni actors could have also been included. And this would have meant a much more inclusive and therefore more legitimate negotiating process with a different constitutional outcome and a different kind of state bargain. Another place where the process could have been different was that had it been internationalized from the beginning, and this would have led, I think, to the same chain of events that I just mentioned, because no international authority would have made that mistake in relationship to the established Iraqi state. So the question is whether these errors, the destruction of the state or the lack of internationalization, were really mere mistakes, or whether they are rooted in something more fundamental. Let me try to conclude by tackling this question, which for me always remains the most difficult one. Recently, I taught a course in Cape Town, South Africa, and I gave a presentation on Iraq. It was a presentation something like this, and I went through pretty much the same kinds of steps, except I didn't get through it because about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes into the discussion, I mentioned the word liberation. And when I mentioned that word, almost all the students in the group, about 40 from different African countries, including from South Africa, immediately attacked me. You cannot use the word liberation in relationship to what happened. And I danced around with them. I couldn't continue with the lecture. I had to dance around, and I said, well, what about, just think about Tanzania and Uganda. Well, was that, the removal of Idi Amin, not really a liberation? And there was one Ugandan student who agreed with me, but no one else in the room, and that was it. And then I said, I'm from Hungary. Actually today is April 4th, and April 4th was the Liberation Day in Hungary 51 years ago. I was about 3 months old at the time, and for Hungarian Jews that was truly a liberation. And I said, a lot of Hungarians thought of it as occupation from the first moment on, but for Hungarian leftists and Jews and so on, people who didn't like the Germans, it was liberation. So it's a question of whose point of view. And he said, no, forget that. It has nothing, there's no liberation. If it's a foreign army, if it's a foreign invasion, liberation is just the wrong category. I just would not give an inch on this particular subject. And I've been sort of asking myself, what is it, aside from, a kind of ingrained habit to oppose the acts of these colonial or neo-colonial or even American imperial power everywhere in the world, which I think is real in the world. Is there something theoretical? Is there some kind of serious issue at stake that they could not see this matter? Because after all, it is a hideous dictatorship. To get rid of Saddam in itself is a good thing. How can one not see that, or Idi Amin for that matter, or Pol Pot in the case of the Vietnamese? There are other examples of foreign forces, after all, liberating in quite the same sense that I use the word. And I come to the following conclusion, is that though they are not generally right, for example, about Tanzania, and Uganda, or about Vietnam, and that in this case they really do have a point, and the point is something like this: can a foreign power that engages in an unprovoked and uninvited war? I mean, no one invited the United States from within Iraq. There is no mass movement within, no upsurge, no, 91 would have been different. I think if in 91 the Americans would have continued the job and removed Saddam, then perhaps this whole question would have been could be looked at differently. But now it wasn't happening. And so could, in such a context, a power be a liberator? That's the first question. I think the more serious one is actually this. Could a foreign power that simultaneously finds itself in opposition to regime, state, and nation be a liberator? This, I think, is the really serious question. Certainly, the removal of the regime is liberation, but that's an abstraction, because if one also destroys the state, which in Iraq is actually the carrier of Iraqi nationality, not for the Kurds, but for the Iraqi Arabs, then is that, from the point of view of Iraqi Arabs, a liberation? Think about the Ayatollah Sistani, who at one point of this adventure was my hero. The Ayatollah Sistani was liberated by all reasonable criteria in March or April, whenever the American troops got to, well, he was in Najaf, so they got to Najaf already earlier than the liberation of Baghdad. I still use the word liberation, you see. Well, the Ayatollah Sistani will not see an American. He will not see an American politician. He will not see an American ambassador. He will see Brahimi. He will see UN officials, but he will not see Americans. To him, in spite of all that, it is just because this, from a national point of view, the Americans represent him humiliation and occupation, and he can't accept what very abstractly may be true, but in fact in this situation is not true, because it is a simultaneous destruction of the foundation of a nationality and the removal of the regime. And when that happens, all the other things I talked about begin to happen, because whom can you trust in such a situation? Whom can you trust in such a situation? Well, only those whose nation who is not threatened in this setting, and that's just the Kurds. So who are you going to favor in every single part of the political process but those who are really on your side wholeheartedly? And so the Kurds, who, I know, Christopher has a long history with them, and I think one can admire the whole history and plight of the Kurds and all the rest, so I don't want to say anything negative. But in this situation, the bargain that was given to the Kurds made the solution of the constitutional problem in Iraq absolutely impossible. But the Americans gave that deal to the Kurds because the Kurds were the only ones they could trust, because the Kurds were the only ones that they actually liberated. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades, since we're here partly to discuss the reciprocal relationship between Iraq and our own country, I thought I might just begin by trying to enforce a distinction which Professor Arato very nearly hit upon himself, which is this: what are we doing in Iraq, and what are its justifications for our own rights and privileges and duties, and what are we doing for them? And how do these rights arise? And how should they be distinguished? And I think if one can bear to think of it in this way and try and keep the two hemispheres of the cerebellum not separated, but for the moment on ice, one might make a little progress in this direction. Suppose it was true, as many people shouted at me from audiences, to my astonishment, in the run-up to the war, that Saddam Hussein had been elected, was the popular choice of the Iraqi people. You must remember that unique in the annals, even I think of Joseph Stalin's referendum on the integration of Lithuania into the Soviet Union, it was not claimed that 100% of the people had voted nor that 100% of them had all voted the same way. I believe Saddam Hussein is the only one to have claimed in the early 2003, with people voting, if you remember, in their own blood, that 100% had turned out and 100% had all voted the same way to make him, confirm him as president for life. I'll dwell on this point just for a second, if I may, for its implications. You have to try and picture, it's impossible to do it, I can tell you. Well, I've been trying for many years and I've been collecting evidence on it, but you must try and imagine what 30 years of that kind of humiliation is like. Of being a citizen who is not a citizen, of being an individual who's not a human being, of being solely and simply the property of a state that rules entirely by force and that is in fact the private property of a psychopathic crime family. You have to imagine being forced to applaud the execution of a member of your family. You have to imagine being shown a video by the secret police of the rape and torture of your daughter. You have to imagine all of this and more, and the use of chemical weapons on unpopular minorities, and the lopping off of the hand of anyone who was caught trading in dollars, the execution immediate of anyone who had a satellite dish. You have to imagine the utter atomization and destruction of a whole society for 3.5 decades, much longer than anyone, even a German who'd lived through Hitler and Stalin, had had to put up with. And all the time, scarcity, famine, war and civil war, and a regime that ruled by divide and rule. Saddam Hussein published a newspaper for, actually it was his son who officially published it in Basra, aimed at a Shia readership that made insulting remarks about the Sunnis. This was done by the regime. In Baghdad, there were newspapers about the filthy rituals of the Shia and the vile heresies promulgated in Basra. And all the time, of course, an attempt to extirpate, to remove from the face of the world the very stubborn resistance of the people of northern Iraq, the Kurds, the largest minority in the region, the largest people in the world by number who don't have a state of their own. This is a nightmare state, a state of terror and volatility, not a stable one, but a state actually of permanent instability and organized for war, for a permanent state of aggression against its neighbors, these aggressions being repeatedly and very brutally carried out. The 100% vote in the referendum is just the, if you like, the Absurdistan portion of this. The badge and symbol. Those Iraqis who you saw doing it were really doing it. They actually did have to go out and sign in their own blood. It was not enough for them to agree. It was not enough for them to subject themselves. They were forced to applaud and participate as well. You're picturing a traumatized and maimed society, and these consequences, which we see around us all the time, cannot entirely be blamed, I think, on the school of thought sometimes called neoconservative. Right? They didn't do this to the Iraqi people. That should be made very plain at the start. But what if, as I'm just about to wander from my point if I don't return to it, what if it had been true? What if 100% of the Iraqi people had really wanted the continuation of the Saddam Hussein's rule? It would have made no difference to us, it seems to me. We would have had to say that's too bad. There are 4 conditions under which a government, a regime, can make itself outside the law, outside international law, and subject to forcible intervention and regime change. These 4 conditions have been agreed, I think, really now for quite some time. I'll restate them for your convenience quickly. On condition of the invasion or occupation of the territory of neighboring countries, a state is deemed to have sacrificed its sovereignty. On condition of the, well, it is. If you remain in occupation of another of a territory of another, you may subject yourself to punitive action from the international community. Shall I put it like that? Shall I put it like that? In the case of the Genocide Convention, to which our government and many others are signatory, the convention mandates international action.
But not loss of sovereignty.
Mandates international action. Well, I think you'll find the consequence is a loss of sovereignty, Doctor, if you don't mind my saying so. You don't think that the presence of foreign troops on your soil or the establishment of no-fly zones over your territory or the imposition of international economic sanctions is an infringement of your sovereignty? I beg to differ. In the case, to continue, in the case of the Genocide Convention, those who sign it are obliged by their signature to act at once to either prevent or to punish a regime that engages in an attempt even to destroy a national minority in whole or in part. Those governments that harbor international terrorists and those governments that violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty may also be brought to account, shall we say. I won't insist here on the sovereignty point. These are the four conditions. Iraq was under the Saddam Hussein regime a serial violator of all those four. I'll just recap. It didn't just invade Kuwait, as is often wrongly described, annexed and absorbed the state of Kuwait, a full member state of the United Nations, full member state of the Arab League, of the Islamic Conference and of the Non-Aligned Movement, into the territory of Iraq, made it the 19th province, attempted to do the same to the Khuzestan provinces of Iran. The loss in point of lives in the first case, the Iranian case, is reckoned to be ultimately perhaps about 1.5 million casualties of young men on both sides. Attempted, even gave a name to the campaign, the Anfal campaign, as it was called, to erase the population of northern Iraq, the Kurdish population, to our shame, with American weaponry, which had also been supplied to them for the war against Iran. Gave repeated encouragement, help, solace, and hospitality to a very large number of international wanted terrorist groups, from Abu Nidal, used to be the most wanted man in the world, to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a very important lieutenant of Osama bin Laden's, who moved directly from Afghanistan to Iraq at a time when countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan were expelling such people from their soil. Iraq was inviting them into the country. I don't need to recall to you that Iraq is under Saddam Hussein, is the only country to have not just secretly developed and tried to extend its development of chemical and biological weapons, but to have used them on Iranians and on Kurds, in other words, within its own borders as well as outside. In other words, if we come to the question of legitimacy, it seems to me that the repeated flouting by the Iraqi regime of every single international instrument and resolution ever passed or adopted, or principle enshrined by the United Nations, is a far greater defiance of international law and of the UN in theory and in practice than any attempt made by either the British or American governments to remove the regime. And it's of interest, in fact, to find that in the halls of the United Nations today, nothing really is talked about that doesn't come under the heading of reform. It seems to have been finally understood, and I hope it's clearly understood in this hall, that the record of the United Nations on Rwanda, where action was positively prevented from being taken to forestall the genocide, to Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, where another ethnocide was in process and had to be stopped by NATO because of the permanent presence of the veto of powers like Russia, China, and France, some of them also repeating this process in the case of Iraq, a regime with which they had very intimate military and economic relations, and we know that several important French and Russian politicians were bought during the course of the Oil for Food program, in which the UN program designed for the alleviation of the suffering of the Iraqi people was turned into something between a bordello and a bourse. And 18 palaces were built, one in every province of Iraq, on the proceeds. The Oil for Palaces program was, as we know it well, the people were made to eat garbage and drink ditch water. This was what came of the reliance upon the authority of the United Nations. It seems to me to act in the spirit and the letter of that organization is to say, no, it is enough. We must move Iraq into the post-Saddam era. Now, I converge my two hemispheres, if you like, for their sake and for ours. We have the right to call for an end to a regime of invasion, of genocide, of the sponsorship of terror, and of the flouting of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have the right to say that regime is a danger to ourselves, and we have a duty to the people of Iraq. As it happens, I was there, I saw it with my own eyes, I won't hear anyone tell me it did not occur. The invading forces were greeted all the length and breadth of the country for days on end with demonstrations of unfakeable joy. I'll never forget seeing it. I will never let anyone tell me I didn't see it either. But that's, if you like, only an extra. They could all have stayed home and just said, well, we'll await developments. Legally and morally, it comes to the same thing. Legally and morally, I don't think it does come to the same thing, that 3 years ago, Saddam Hussein, a leading member of the Fascist International, a man whose party ideology was based in part on National Socialism and in part on emulation of Stalinism, who had concentrated the entire resources of a country into his own hands and those of his family. Everything in the country, including its people, was privately held by him. That this man is gone and in jail where he deserves to be, and on trial where he should have been a long time ago. And instead we have elected, as the president of Iraq, General Talabani, whose people 10 years ago were being subject to genocide, and whose party, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, is the corresponding party in Iraq of the Socialist International. In other words, of the International of Parties of Social Democracy, from the British Labour Party, the French Socialist Party. I don't think that that's too bad, frankly. There's nothing, people keep looking at me, sometimes asking me questions as if I owe them an explanation for why Iraqis have elected President Talabani instead of being forced to sign in their own blood a confirmation of a psychopathic dictator. Right? It doesn't seem to me I'm the one who owes the explanation here. Now, I don't know how far I've trespassed on my time, but am I getting close?
You have 5 more minutes.
Okay, well, that's great. I shan't need all 5. I had thought of calling my talk in a sort of neo-Hegelian way, The Cunning of History, Maureen Dowd, and the Pottery. But I decided that would be too flippant a way in which to begin. I don't know how many of you followed the writings of the great philosopher Maureen Dowd, but she at one point came up with a phrase which I think has been echoed since by Colin Powell, or maybe she got it from him or he from her, I can't be certain. But you know what the Pottery Barn motto is. Probably, it may have been the other way around. You know what the motto is of the Pottery Barn: you break it, you own it. And I remember thinking at first that was a flippant thing for Maureen Dowd to say about Iraq and the United States. But then I thought, as a matter of fact, there's a good deal of truth in that. In that Iraq was already broken. I've mentioned some of the reasons why that was so. And we already owned it. If there's to be an inquest into what's gone wrong and what's gone right in Iraq, and I think that there ought to be, and I'm more than willing to take part in it, and have so far not refused or declined any challenge to do so, if there is to be this inquest, then it cannot start 3 years ago, not for anyone with any sense at all of history or for geopolitics. The very latest, I believe, or do I mean the very earliest it could begin? The very latest, really, would be 1969, when 68, 69, when, according to many boastful accounts by our Central Intelligence Agency, we were successful in installing the anti-communist wing of the Iraqi, the most anti-communist wing of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, the wing that had Saddam Hussein as its chief police enforcer in power in Baghdad. That seems to me to give us quite a lot of responsibility right there and then, if only that were all. But the great Baptist human rights campaigner and moralist Jimmy Carter, 10 years after that, gave, as we know, explicit permission to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran, and gave him also, a phrase that's become familiar to us recently, false intelligence, to the effect that a quick strike against Iran would demolish the regime of Ayatollah Khomeini, release the American hostages, re-elect Jimmy Carter, other wonderful consequences that could be imagined. And we know what the outcome of that was. I'll dwell on it a little. One of the most horrifying wars of modern times, human wave assaults using children, mutual bombardment of civilian targets, the unleashing of chemical and biological weapons, perhaps 1.5 million dead, for nothing. Through the entire course of that war, the succeeding Reagan administration was the armorer, a trainer and diplomatic protector, reflagger of the tankers of Saddam Hussein. And when the war was over, and when Saddam Hussein continued to use those sinews of war to pursue his campaign of extermination in northern Iraq, the flow of American weaponry, advice and counsel and protection did not cease. This seems to me to give us a very weighty responsibility in walk away from this. We owe them, okay? They owe us too, in a sense, because their country was the site and the place, and their leader was, it's their misfortune, the leader of all this and planner of all this aggression and violation of international law. But we have to make up for what we helped him do to them too. So all talk of withdrawal is idle. There's no such thing as a withdrawal. A maimed and broken Iraq was in our future, was in our present, and was in our past, and still is. This is a responsibility which we cannot evade. And that's why I sympathize with so much of what Professor Arato says about the incompetence with which this mandate has been discharged. But let there be no mistake, the rubric of this meeting is quite correct to mention Iraq and America in the same breath. And I hope I've shown that it's in some way an indissoluble connection, and one to which we haven't begun to live up, but one to which everyone here considers themselves a citizen can contribute something. There are mass graves to be dug up. There are women to be protected from both kinds of fundamentalists, those who are against the intervention and those who are for it. There's the national minority of Kurdistan to be confirmed in its autonomy. There's the ecology of the marsh Arabs in the south, the oldest wetlands in the Middle East, to be reflooded and recuperated. There's plenty of work for everyone to do, and anyone who wants to get any advice on how to contribute is welcome to ask me afterwards. And thank you for your patience meanwhile. I'm sorry I had to be fanned to a halt there. I just wanted to do that.
Okay, Martín and I have several questions that we've been wanting to ask both of you. I'll start with Andrew. What should have been done in Iraq instead of going to war? Or in general, what should we do with massively abusive dictatorial states as an international community?
Well, I think that I spent a lot of my life on that problem, not in relationship to the Near or Middle East, thank God. And I think that one answer is certainly not that one should not intervene, because one always intervenes. I've intervened in 2 countries myself, in Poland and Hungary. And one intervenes because, in fact, these matters are international matters. Human rights, problems of autonomous civil society are international matters. But it's extremely important to distinguish between hard and soft intervention. And I think it's very important that in the 1980s and 1990s, even including the South African case, where indeed sanctions were applied, interventions stayed within international law. By the way, Chapter 7 is binding even in relationship to the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention does not mandate anyone on their own. It doesn't mean somebody violates the Genocide Convention and Denmark decides to go to war against that country. You need a Chapter 7 authorization anyway. Of course, one could accuse Saddam of having violated the Genocide Convention, but there is still a need for a Chapter 7 authorization. And it's not up for an imperial superpower to decide, not in 91 when he's actually violating the convention, but in 2003 when he may be violating it, but not in the same way as he has at other moments. This is a question of Chapter 7, at least if you're talking about international law and not about, superpower morality. Anyway, soft intervention works in many cases, and I think that is certainly preferable from a point of view of democratization. Its chances, as we see the track record, even in places now like the Ukraine and Georgia, are much better. Military intervention, if you really, I heard in a very bad speech Francis Fukuyama in Paris a few weeks ago, in the way that political scientists tend to do it, counted up American military interventions, and he came up with 25, which had to do with regime change. He's actually mixing apples and pears, as political scientists tend to in these cases. But nevertheless, out of the 25, he comes up with 3 successes. And that is not a great track record, especially if you take Germany and Japan as 2 of the successful cases, with a very long history of rule of law states and constitutionalism and relatively short interruptions by dictatorship. So the chances of military intervention succeeding are slim. And so if we are interested in democratization, if that is our problem, then I think we have to try every possible way to to push in the direction of extending the time within which soft interventionism can work. I grant, in the case of Saddam, this was not a very hopeful strategy. In the case of Saddam, I would stress, and I think that Christopher has grossly neglected it, that the inspection process and the United Nations process of actually fairly hard, soft intervention, as this very last inspection process was, has not only disarmed Saddam, but was on the verge of destabilizing the regime altogether. And this, I think, could have been continued. I'm not suggesting that the outcome would have been perhaps anything more than a neo-Baath state, but perhaps a neo-Baath authoritarian state would have been a possible terrain for soft interventionism. Who knows? Anyway, prospects for democratization to the method that we have chosen are poor. Historically, they have been poor, and they are extremely poor in Iraq. You know, President Talabani, you can't, that's not analysis to tell me that the president is this wonderful man. You know, you may know him, I don't know him, he's very attractive and he's charming and all the rest. But that doesn't mean anything. You know, you have to look at the political situation now, which is really dismal. You say we should stay, but we're almost at the point of shooting at our own troops who really, in some situations, no longer know which side they're actually fighting on. And I can give you illustrations of that if you're interested. And you probably know what I mean, because you know Ahmed Chalabi, whom you probably know personally. There was one incident when literally his Pentagon guard was almost shot at by CIA troops, and they had to be called off just an hour earlier so that wouldn't happen. We are on the verge of incidents like that now in Iraq. So the situation is really fairly dismal. You know, you can't just say, well, Taliban is president. He is president. But the process of democratization is going extremely poorly.
Thank you. At the end, can you?
Well, I think there were two challenges to me there, so I don't want anyone to think I would avoid them.
You'll get a chance at the end. How about?
Oh, well, fine.
Okay. So I have a question for you. As I understand it, your argument for the war, and as you laid it out, is about the need for regime change, right? And it's always been that way. It's been consistently that way. Are there other countries that might meet this criteria for intervention? Should it be the U.S. that does the invading?
If you remember the four criteria I advanced, I don't think there is any other country that meets all four of them. The North Korean famine is a terror famine in some ways. I don't think it quite rises to the level of genocide. Of course, it's true that North Korea has openly and disgracefully flouted the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but North Korea holds South Korea hostage. We can't even make a conventional attack without appreciating that, given the irrationality that always accompanies totalitarian rule, that North Korea might not decide to go out by destroying the city of Seoul, now the capital finally of a democratic ally. Which it can do with conventional weaponry alone. But that's only a limiting case. No, I don't think there is or was another case of such a regime violating all four of these criteria and also becoming increasingly unstable, volatile, and irrational, to the point where it seemed to be an emergency. But I think I could be much clearer on the question of should it be the United States. Suppose now, to return to Chapter 7 and the United Nations, suppose that General Romeo Dallaire, the very brave Quebecois Canadian commander of the UN contingent in Kigali, whose faxes we have, and anyone can look them up, was sent urgently from his command post in Kigali, saying that with the help of some dissident Hutu forces, liberal Hutu, he had discovered, as indeed he had, the exact time and place and date and disposition of the beginning of the genocide, which was as you know, no outbreak suddenly of ethnic hatred, but a very coldly and carefully planned operation. That he discovered this time and date and place, and that he proposed the UN forces be quickly doubled, which would be from about 200 to about 400, and a démarche made to the Rwandan government to the effect that we knew what was in their mind, that there was a chance at least of forestalling it enough for a proper operation to be mounted. Now suppose those faxes, which landed on Kofi Annan's desk were addressed to him personally and never got off that desk. Let us imagine that they had been put before the UN as an urgent matter, as eventually in a form they were by, I believe, a resolution of the Czech Republic, that action be taken immediately to forestall the genocide in Rwanda. What government do you think would have got the mandate to execute that resolution? Well, the question answers itself, does it not?
Only we have the plane.
Who has the planes, the heavy lifting stuff that's needed for the medicine, for the trucks, for the food, for all the rest of it? Who has the special forces that would have had to, don't be in any doubt about this, would have had to open fire at some point on the Hutu power militia, would have had to shed blood, would have had to show force, would have had to say this far and no further? Who's going to do, everyone knows who it would have to be. But of course that knowledge is the one that convicts the United States of being unilateralist. So
No.
I leave it there.
Why?
Well, because only the United States can do it, because only the United States can propose it and carry it out, its actions are by definition always described as unilateralist. The day I hear the New York Times refer to the French threat of a veto, a single French veto, as unilateralist, I'll change my tone.
Excuse me for a second. For example, I said, and I'm not the only one who's ever said this, that had they gotten a moral majority of the Council, for example, for Kosovo, I think, it was just a Russian veto. And I said, for me, that changes a lot, because it does mean something that when the majority of the Security Council, the overwhelming majority, votes one way, that this veto, which is now an absolute institution, in my mind at least, stops the action. That's quite different than in this particular case when you can only get 4 or 5 countries to support it. So the unilateral would be is when 1 or 2 countries decide, and then they put together a coalition of willing from whoever you find, around the block. That's unilateral.
Or NATO, as in.
But NATO doesn't support the Iraq war.
I think you'll find that the Chinese were also willing to veto any intervention to restore the status quo ante and legal and moral in Kosovo.
I have a question for Andrew that actually addresses this a little bit. Can you tell us more specifically, or I guess what do you think about the claim that it was the U.S. who was enforcing UN resolutions?
Well, it's just wrong. Because, first of all, it's interesting how the United States, actually, U.S. government never felt the need to give legal justification for the war. There's no white paper or anything else. Here the U.S. government spoke the language of power politics. It was different in Britain, in your country or your ex-country, because there was this Lady Falconer and whoever else, this other gentleman who wrote a paper under the name of the Attorney General, making an argument, which I'll turn to in a second. But this was not the thing that was submitted by the Attorney General to the Prime Minister. What he actually submitted was that the legality of this thing doesn't look very good, and he made an argument similar to what most international lawyers in this case make, namely that the initial Gulf War is the Security Council's war, and only the Security Council can revive it. 1441 doesn't have an automatic mechanism, and therefore you need a new resolution. In fact, they went back for a new resolution, so Tony Blair at least felt that in Britain you had to represent the case as if you needed a new resolution. They just didn't get it. Now, the contrary case, and I have to look at my notes because I have to remember the numbers, which are many. The contrary cases that you argue on the basis of Resolution 678, 686, and 687, which imply that the original Gulf War, the ceasefire, and then the conditions of the ceasefire are such that if Iraq violates the conditions of the ceasefire, the war can be recommenced. This, I think, is the argument. The problem with it is that 686 has such a clause, but 687 clearly supersedes it, and all the countries voting for it, without at that time even being negated by the United States, indicate that the only reasons that some of them are voting for it is because it no longer has that particular proviso. So there is no automatism until 1441, and then 1441, with the exception of the United States, no one declares that it has any kind of automatism. In fact, Russia, France, and China declare immediately after the vote that the only reason they voted for it, they are two countries with veto power, is because there is no automatism. So you need a new resolution. They don't go back for it. Well, this sounds like absurd legalism, and I agree that if I was that Belgian or Canadian general in Kigali, and somebody was worrying about these numbers here in California or in New York, and people are being massacred there, that would be truly absurd, right? Because on some level you have to act, and you know, if enough people are being killed, I don't even care about unilateralism. I have to say that unilateralism doesn't frighten me under all possible circumstances. Okay. But the point is that this is not the situation at the moment of the outbreak of the Iraq War, and so you could actually get a resolution, and in fact. The problem is that the American government not only doesn't want a resolution, but a significant part of the American government wants the war precisely to discredit the whole UN process. I mean, this is a significant part of the motivation of the Cheney part, and Cheney says so over and over again, of that part of the American policymaking apparatus. It's true that there are also people in the State Department who value international law more than he does. But I mean, you know, this is not Chris Hitchens' war. But as far as Cheney's war, and as far as the war of many of the neoconservative intellectuals, which is not exactly the same thing, is concerned, this war is as much a war against international law as it is against Saddam. So for them, the fact that there is no legal justification for it is not a problem. It's actually a good thing, because you have to discredit precisely these mechanisms and replace them by something else. We'll see what that's going to be.
I can't wait to the end for this, because it has to follow on. I didn't even sound as if I was accusing you of absurd legalism. I think the etiquette of this is very important. For example, it was very hard to be sure that the Anglo-American no-fly zone enforcement that protected northern and southern Iraq from a renewal of Saddam's attentions really was established by a UN resolution in its continuation. It seems to me quite possible that it was not, but nor was it condemned by any resolution, nor was it illegal. And that's a narrow but deep difference, and I think it's well worth observing. I think if we can all design alternative wars, plausible ones they'd better be, I think the President's speech to the UN on the September 11th, 2002, calling attention to the extraordinary thesaurus of unenforced and ignored and flouted resolutions on Iraq, recalling the UN to its duty, which it agreed it had neglected, which is why the inspectorate in its very weak form was returned to the country. I'm going to do inspections at the end, but this is just for now. Why everyone said, yes, okay, Mr. President, you're right about this. We really have neglected this. We must send the inspectors back in. If they'd further said, look, you're right in what else you say about the regime, we have let down the Iraqi people, and we have let ourselves be insulted by the Iraqi regime. Let us all agree to cooperate in moving Iraq into the post-Saddam era. Let's not say liberation, let's just say helping Iraq into the post-Saddam era. What will it take to recuperate the economy? What will it take to repair the damage done by the sanctions? What will it take to identify the victims and try the war criminals? How will we get this done as a community? It was open to every member state of the UN, including all members of the Security Council, to say that, and they didn't, with the exception of the government of the United Kingdom. In fact, two of them, as we now know, as we knew then actually, but as we've now since had confirmed from captured documents of the Iraqi cabinet, repeatedly gave assurances to Saddam Hussein that no UN resolution could ever harm him. This is not the behavior of a responsible member state of the Security Council, I'm sorry to say, to be giving private assurances to a dictator that he need not worry about any action from the United Nations and that they can guarantee that this is so. That's a scandal. So is the current situation in Darfur, much worse than a scandal. But on this occasion, we've decided to follow the path laid down by Kofi Annan and the admirers of the UN procedure. And I hope everyone's extremely happy with what's eventuated.
But my question is, what resolutions did he really flout? Because the only thing you can say he flouted was kicking out the inspectors. Because in fact he did disarm. I mean, we now know he actually did.
We know he did not.
Well, we do know he has, because he doesn't have any. He didn't have any, and now we are sure of that.
We are not.
1441, it's true, he kicked out the inspectors, but once he let them in, he flouted no Security Council resolutions whatsoever. He was in full compliance. Israel is not in full compliance of many Security Council resolutions. I hate to say, because, you know, I was mildly Zionist at one point myself. But Israel is in full violation of many Security Council resolutions. Saddam, it looked like he was, but with this very complicated and stupid game that he was playing, actually it turns out he was not. And with 1441, he actually let them back, and then he certainly was not. He was not flouting anything, the poor guy.
Well, it takes a lot to make me cry, and
Well,
I'm trying to summon as much sympathy for him as I can, but
but
you're quite simply wrong on the facts. It seems to me the Iraqi
What is
government
it
was required to give a list of what it held in point of weaponry, banned weaponry.
But how can you
It
give a list if you don't have any?
It gave this list. It gave this list. We still have. I
Right.
could give you a copy
Right.
of what it claimed to have. There's been no accounting to this day by the Iraqi government of what it did with what was on that list. We haven't found it. I'd love to know. But at no point did the Iraqi government
not even
come in.
Dick Cheney.
At
You're the
no
last one who
point
thinks
were
that
they
there's
at
somewhere.
no point
Gentlemen.
were they in compliance
Because
with
even
the
Dick
letter of the
Cheney
Gentlemen,
doesn't
I
think
have
he's
these
gonna
really,
find them.
really nice questions
And
that I
you're the only
wrote.
one
I'm
beyond
quite
Dick
proud of
Cheney
them.
who thinks that you're going to find them.
I don't think we're going to find them.
You're-
I'd love to know what happened to them, though.
You're the same way with the Al-Qaeda connection.
Well, shall I just-
Even Dick Cheney doesn't think you're going to find it, and you are the last one in the universe who thinks you're going to find the Al-Qaeda connection.
And you think Mr. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is a fiction of my imagination?
He was in Kurdistan, in Kurdish-held territory, although it's to be sure not a group that the Kurds themselves control.
Certainly
He was not in a territory that Saddam
The
controlled.
Kurds warned the State Department of his crossing.
Cole pointed it out to you that he was not in territory that Saddam controlled.
No, he
And
was
in spite of the fact that you told this, you repeat the same thing to an
He
audience.
was in territory that Saddam Hussein wanted to control, and his Ansar al-Islam group was trying to kill the Kurdish leadership. A strange thing for a jihadist group to want to do. First thing is to try and kill the main opposition to Saddam Hussein. I don't suppose there could be anything suspicious about that.
Listen.
But at a time when every country in the world was expelling jihad sympathizers who were on the run from Afghanistan, Iraq was welcoming them onto
If
its
this were so, the American government would be trumpeting this everywhere, on the street, on every...
between the Iraqi Baath Party and the Al-Qaeda.
You're literally the last person who believes in these
No,
things.
I'm not. No, I'm not.
And you
But
go
I
around
wouldn't mind
saying
being the
it.
only one to say so. I wouldn't be afraid. But does it happen?
Who the
So
hell
I
are you
can-
supposed to be
I'm
afraid
willing-
of?
I'm
The
willing-
CIA?
I'm willing
All
to,
right, all right, all right, all
I'm
right.
willing to materialize. I'm willing to materialize everything I say.
Next question.
It might take a little patience.
I mean, that's really sad.
Andrew. Thank you. I can take care of myself. Andrew. I want to ask you more about the Iraqi Constitution. When I looked it up, I found a quote from the Constitution. I think it's from the most current version, which says, "The Constitution is the highest law of the land. No law may be passed that contradicts the Constitution, the undisputed laws of Islam, or the principles of democracy." Is this tenable? Leaving aside the knotty question of which laws of Islam are not disputed and which ones are, won't there be a moment when there's a conflict between the law of Islam and the law of the Constitution, and who's going to win?
Well, I was sort of taken aback by the previous discussion, and now you're putting me on this other track.
I know.
Deal with it.
Because it sort of frightens me that there is still someone who goes around says these things when in the eyes of the main propagators of these connections, they have become totally untenable. But okay, let's let it go. You know, it's just, it's sort of, I sort of have to kind of come to my, myself, my sweet, friendly, come back to my sweet, friendly self. And
that may take longer.
You know, well, that may take longer. The problem is not these symbolic declarations. In fact, you know, there could be laws that would contradict one and contradict the other, and so neither would be passed. But this is not where the issue really lies. And in case people are really interested in issues like the fate of women, or the fate of gays, or the fate of Christians in the Iraq to come, there are some very important clues in the new constitution to what that is going to be like. Not in Kurdistan, admittedly. And it has to do with the status law, which basically allows each, if the plans of the religious sectarians are realized, would allow each community to basically administer everything that connected to family life, marriage, divorce, inheritance, to some extent even the status of women and men in courts and in litigation, according to the religious law of that particular community. Now, this law is going to be passed, according to the Constitution, by simple majority of Parliament. But there is the provision that you mentioned. That is, the law which will be passed has to be compatible both with Islam and with the principles of democracy. And the Constitution also foresees the creation of a constitutional court. This constitutional court is going to have both secular and Sharia judges, but it's not said how many. Everything depends on how many. You know, it's like the Sharia judges are like, well, in our context, let us say they will resemble, I don't know whom, maybe, I don't know, I guess I should make analogies like that. The Sharia judges will represent the extreme version of the status law, and secular judges may represent a better and more liberal perspective. But the number is what matters, really, how many of each. And this can be achieved only through 2/3 of the vote of Parliament. It seems to me that according to the current numbers of the last election, there will not be 2/3 of Parliament, either for a secular-dominated court or for a religiously dominated court. They're just not going to be able to create a court because of this issue, which means what? It means that they're not going to have a court, which means that the status law will be decided by simple majority, and that means that the secular elements of Parliament are not going to be able to outvote the religious majority, which is going to be not just Shiite, but also Sunni. So in actual fact, the contradiction between, let's say, not democracy, because in this case it's liberal values we're talking about, liberal values and religious values will be resolved consistently in the favor of in the religious direction. The reason I say it, that this matter will not touch Kurdistan, because the way that the Constitution has been structured is that the Kurd region already has nullification rights. This is in general not a good thing. In the United States, John C. Calhoun pushed this, and we know what the consequences would have been, except that in the United States it never really was established, even in the heydays of the slave system. I don't think nullification is a principle that would allow Iraq really to stay together in general, but on this particular issue, the nullification rights of the Kurds would allow the Kurds to keep themselves away from the domination of a legal structure in which religious courts take over jurisdiction over family matters. So I think, with the exception of Kurdistan, women's rights are in big trouble in the new Iraq. I don't say this for demagogic reasons. You notice I didn't, in my speech, put this first and foremost. I think in the United States right now, I would not take Roe versus Wade as the issue that I would concentrate on in relationship to the transformation of the Supreme Court, which you also wanted to talk about. I think that the powers, the prerogative powers of the executive are much more serious and much more important and represent much greater dangers for us. In Iraq, I think the issue that is really salient today is the issue of federalism. What kind of federalism Iraq is going to have, and Iraq will break apart over that issue. Well, we talk about it if you want to. But the second major issue that you ask about, and it's not going well, except with respect to the Kurd region.
Christopher, somewhat related, is there ever a good reason to have an ethnically characterized federalist system? And is that what we're going to have in Iraq?
Well, the situation in Iraq reminds me of the apples and pears, to borrow his analogy, that was applied in the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina. If you remember, you were told every day during the fighting there that there was the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims. What's wrong with that trinity, as it were? They're not comparing like with like. I used to wish, actually, that it was the other way around, and people would say the Orthodox, the Catholics, and the Bosnians, which would have been actually slightly more accurate. It would be very nice to see the newspapers saying today the Christian Orthodox shelled Sarajevo again. It would have been better than criminalizing all the Serbs for that action, and much more true to the actual spirit of what was being done. Or that yesterday the Roman Catholics again trained their artillery on the city of Mostar instead of the Croats. And it would have been much more true to say the Bosnians than the Muslims, certainly in the case of Sarajevo. But everyone got that all wrong all the time with terrible consequences. And it trained us in ghettoizing our own minds as well as the life of the people of the Balkans. Well, the same thing is being done in Iraq. The Kurds, for example, are, to not 100% extent, but I think at least 70% Sunni people. Not just in Iraq, but in Turkey and Syria and elsewhere. But it's always the Kurds, the Sunni, and the Shia, if you notice. There's a very big split between the Shia parties as to those who take something like a Khomeiniist view of their religion. That's to say, the Velayat-i Faqih, the Shia principle that the mullahs should be the parents and guardians of the entire state and society, and those who don't, who take the view of Ayatollah Sistani. There's no unified Shia view, therefore. An enormous number of Sunnis welcomed the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and still do. And so the whole picture, as partitioned in this way, in our minds and on the ground, is in some ways fundamentally misleading. And the only ethnic question is that of Kurdistan, the largest minority in the country and the largest minority in the region. Even the Saddam Hussein constitution described Iraq as a state of Arabs and Kurds, not as an Arab state. Iraq is a member of the Arab League, but it's described as a state of Arabs and Kurds. I don't think there's any alternative to ethnicizing it to that extent. I mean, it would be impossible not to say that there was a non-Arab people within Iraq's border, and the European Union is increasingly insisting that Turkey makes the same avowal and admission in its own political arrangements. So I just wish it could be done without this relentless categorization that I think has helped, in the way we formulate it, to reproduce itself in actual Iraqi conditions, and is creating a situation where people more and more must think of themselves in terms of identity politics.
Can I say something constructive to that? Not argue anything, but just add. The fact is that, and I agree actually with what you just said, but the fact is that it has become more ethnicized, and it has become ethnicized in part because that's how the American occupying authority has dealt with the various Iraqi groups. And it has become ethnicized also because in response to Kurdish claims, the others have made similar claims. Now, the problem is ethnicity, geography, and resources. I mean, there are three things which are involved here. I think everybody knows this because I think people who read the newspaper know that Kurdistan and the south and the southeast have oil, but the Sunni provinces, the three major Sunni provinces, and of course Baghdad, have none. Roughly, because no one knows what the amounts are in terms of future resources, one could say 50, 50, 0. But it could be a little different than that. It could be 40, 0, 60, or 60, 0, 40. Let's say 50, 0, 50. Now, once the Kurdistan region is conceded, with the likelihood that it's going to control, and in the new constitution, as far as future resources are concerned, it is going to control its own oil resources. That means that from a point of view of the Shiite religious leadership, that particular province, that region with three provinces, but only 22%, 23% of the people is getting 50% of the oil. That's 50% of the resources taken out of the country by a quarter of the population. They themselves have 50% of the people and let's say 50% of the oil. From their point of view now, they have to share, if they share that with the other 25% of the population, that's a formula for the continued impoverishment of their own region, which is the poorest actually in Iraq. So their answer to it, which in fact Iranian policy has strongly supported, okay, the Kurds have their region, we have our region, ethnically based also. So instead of what would be reasonable, namely a provincially based federal system for Iraq as a whole, or even Kurdistan and a provincially based federal system for the Arab part of Iraq, they have raised the demand of a ethnically based regional system for the south, whether that is 9 provinces as in one of the demands, or 3 or 6. Actually, it is 6 in the current version, but doesn't really much matter because the oil is always in that particular package. That's a formula for the total impoverishment of the Sunni provinces, and from the American point of view, a formula for perpetual civil war. So ethnicization is also the problem of resources, and with the concession of Kurdistan, as reasonable as that may be from a historical point of view, the ethnicization and the regionalization of Iraqi politics has been almost unavoidable. But with that turn, we cannot find a reasonable solution for the kind of problem that we are confronting, and Americans are going to be dying, literally, for many years to come, if they seek to manage this type of reorganization of the country, because it cannot really be managed.
We're going to move on now to discussing the United States in particular.
Well, ask him because I just spoke, so he should go next.
Sure, all right. Christopher, as I understand neoconservatism, and I admit I'm not at all an expert, there is an idea of supporting the project of American power and influence, particularly in the Middle East, and to do so by force if necessary. At least part of this rationale, and a very serious one for you, I know, is because of a fear of radical religiosity, or Islamic fascism as you term it. However, in the United States, the neoconservatives are allied in the Republican Party with the religious right. At what point are the neoconservatives and the religious right going to come to a head? Is this going to happen? Is this going to lead to a division in the party?
Well, to begin with, there's no faction in American politics, or no important faction, that isn't in favor of using force in the Middle East, or that hasn't repeatedly had recourse to it. To say that they're willing to use force for American power would be a definition of anyone running for office in any one of the two houses or seeking the nomination for the presidency. That's not what distinguishes the so-called neoconservative view. That's distinguished, in my opinion, in this way. When I first ran across this school, so-called, it was in the early Reagan years, it was mainly distinguished by an attachment to it's wrong to call it a theory, but a notion of Jean Kirkpatrick's, a famous essay on dictatorships and double standards, which suggested that the United States should be more lenient on dictatorships that she called authoritarian, tending as they were to be pro-American, than on those that were totalitarian, those that demanded a complete conscription of society and of the citizen into the state. Thus, in practice, meaning go easy on Pinochet, on General Marcos, President Marcos, I mean, people of that stripe and kidney. But there's been an unnoticed metamorphosis in this over the last couple of decades, attributable mainly to Paul Wolfowitz, who actually, in the course of the Reagan administration, won an argument with Jeane Kirkpatrick to the effect that it was time to dump the Marcos regime in the Philippines. He said, if you keep supporting the regime in the name of your bases there, you'll lose the bases as well as the regime. Better to dump the regime and risk the bases than to go on in this way. Actually won that argument and argued for the same in Indonesia later on. It's really mainly with him personally that this interpretation in the Middle East is identified, and his view was that the risk of democracy in Iraq, of imposing it, if you like, or if you prefer, releasing it, but at any rate of removing the dictatorial obstacle to it was tremendously risky, but not as risky as carrying on with dictatorship. I think that's a principle worth bearing in mind for everything that you hear about the current very distressing and agonizing consequences of democratic and federal attempts at pluralism in Iraq. They are as nothing, in my view, to the risks of continuing with the Saddam Hussein dictatorship. That's the gamble that's been taken, and that's why we have the extraordinary situation of a president and a vice president who campaigned against Gore and Lieberman, openly saying they were opposed to regime change, opposed to nation building, opposed to humanitarian intervention, opposed to the use of American force for any of these purposes, suddenly, and who wanted to lift the sanctions on Iraq and on Libya, because they're oil men above all. That was blood for oil, was when the piece of the graveyard of Saddam Hussein was underwritten by the oil companies. That really was a blood for oil. These oil men and conservative Republicans suddenly decide to go to war with the status quo. I've never seen anything like it as a political change in my life since Ronald Reagan decided that the theory of nuclear deterrence and mutual assured destruction was mistaken in mid-administration. Suddenly, you were being told by Republicans, don't you know that mutual assured destruction and deterrence is unstable and immoral? And I said, yeah, I've been trying to say that for 20 years. But this was, of course, when they were trying to sell the Star Wars program. I've never seen a doctrinal change as big as this. The Christian right just goes along, it seems to me. They didn't want this war. If they'd wanted a war in the region, if they'd asked if they wanted one, they'd have chosen Sudan, because their co-religionists are very much involved there, and actually it's to their credit that they've kept the issue of slavery and genocide alive in Darfur and Sudan and elsewhere. Iraq was no big business of theirs. You can find mentions of Iraq in the Bible, but they could have put that off. The real question is whether there'll be a split between them and the neoconservatives, or within them, on the question of the policy of Israel in the occupied territories, or not, and that remains to be seen. But and I'll go there if you like, but I think that will take us miles from Mesopotamia, and I'm in enough trouble as it is.
Andrew, how important is the expansion of the executive powers under Bush? Is it unprecedented? Have we never seen anything like this before? Or is the Bush's administration virtual suspension of the division of powers in all things concerning the war on terror something we cannot turn back from? Can we get to a more balanced state?
Well, we're leaping, and there are really interesting parts of this thing that Christopher just talked about. He's been a big critic of realism, and I have not been myself a realist because I actually believe in international law, which they don't. But as it happens, the realists have predicted one consequence of this war, namely that Iran is going to be the big winner. And we have to recognize, Scowcroft is not my man, but the reason he didn't want it is for that reason. And Iran is now the winner. But this actually could mean a realignment of the realists and the neoconservatives, because it makes, in both of their eyes, Iran, for quite different reasons, the big enemy. I actually think that we're on collision course with Iran. Namely, the United States could not have fought this war in Iraq, lose all this treasure, sacrifice all these wonderful human beings, create all that devastation, lose so much prestige, just to hand over the Gulf basically to Iran, which is really a new power, and is making new alliances with the Russians and the Chinese as well, and is going to be just stronger and stronger. Moreover, we have created a kind of premium for them to go nuclear. They might have wanted to go nuclear anyway, but now I think they have to hurry and go nuclear because the United States is not actually able to act very soon, given the fact that we have depleted our land forces in Iraq itself. So actually, we're on collision course, and now the realists, on the basis of geopolitical considerations, would have to actually reevaluate their perspective on this question. Actually, this is not unrelated to Stacy's issue, because the problem in the United States is not just the question of Ashcroft or Cheney or some other people in the Justice Department who don't like civil liberties very much. The problem is the relationship of people like that to the war power. And this issue is not new at all. I wonder if people really realize what is the first moment when the war power is used in a way that points beyond what has been called the Locke, Blackstone, Jefferson model of emergency that has been up to that point prevalent in American history, which sort of consisted in committing acts of illegality in moments of emergency and then posing the question to Congress that whether Congress will support it and the courts, whether the courts will sustain it. Lincoln still did this as late as his suspension of habeas corpus in the beginning of the Civil War. But interestingly, the Emancipation Proclamation is the first moment when the war power is used in a truly modern sense, when he actually does something that he himself thought even a constitutional amendment could not do, because the Emancipation Proclamation actually takes away property in contrary to the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which the Dred Scott decision explained, and of course one knew before also one could not do. The war power could go further than the constitutional amendment. This is a tremendous expansion of what has now been called the inherent power of the presidency. This is more than just the president doing something illegal in a moment of a situation of dire emergency, when you just have to do what you can, as John Locke has already described. And Jefferson, for example, repeats during his presidency. This is claiming that the president has an actual legal and constitutional right to do those things and more, whatever winning the war requires. Now, we forget this because Lincoln did it in the name of such a good cause. But it is nevertheless a very, very serious matter, because since that time, that power has been expanding. The point is not that Bush has added a lot to it. In fact, they're adding relatively small things to it each time. The interesting line of development, which I try to reconstruct in an article, is always during a war, the presidency in the beginning goes rather far in demanding more and more inherent powers. The courts during the war and Congress too tend to sustain it. Then toward the end of the war or after the war, Congress, well, usually the courts actually first, take away some of the powers, but always something of the new claims is left. And so we have a kind of incremental development toward an increasingly executive-centered government, which in relationship to war and emergency is less and less controllable, at least in the moment of the emergencies. And that's the problem when you are facing a war where the distinction between internal and external has ended, and when the time frame of the war has been extended in such a way that we no longer know. You know, you've written on Orwell. If the next war is going to be against Iran before this one is completed, we are really going to be in like one of these Orwellian wars when there's never an end to war, even though people here back home live basically as they have lived before, and yet the presidency or the executive power can make claims on the basis of that of a war situation. And the other branches of power are not going to be able to do very much about it. Look at even, look at Hamdi and then today Padilla, which has come out. It's not that the courts do nothing. It's not that Agamben is right and that we're living in a lawless space. That's all caca. I hope you know that Austro-Hungarian term. It's not true that we're in a lawless space where the courts and Congress and others do not have anything to say. We're not in that kind of situation. Other powers are active, but they are always doing less and less and giving the executive more and more. And that's really the danger now, not because of what he might do tomorrow during the context of this particular war, but what he will do during a war against Iran, and then subsequently. So we must get out of this. And so Michael Walzer warned me. I was very much a supporter of the Afghanistan war. I thought that this was a just war. It was also authorized, by the way, by the Security Council under Article 51. I had no problem with it. And in a discussion with him in New York, I said, you know, and it is part of the war against terror. He said, don't use this war against terror. You know, he said, he wrote a very, very good book on just war. And he said, you know, the Americans, he said, you know, you don't know them well enough. You know, I'm Hungarian. He said, when they talk about war, they go nuts. You know, when they think they're in war, they allow the executive to do anything. You know, just get away from the war language. You know, it's extremely dangerous. I have to say that he was absolutely right about that. And the one thing, you know, I'm beginning to like you much, much more during this discussion because you are handling yourself, you know, in such a cooperative and friendly way. But I have to say that you really are a spokesman for this war against terror in a very open-ended way. Let me just quote one line. You see, I'm very ungrateful here because you are so friendly, and yet I'm going to do this here because it's really important. And ultimately, even though Plato was a good friend of mine, truth is a better friend still. You know who said that. The training and hardening of many thousands of American servicemen and women in a battle against the forces of nihilism and absolutism, which training and hardening will surely be of great use in future combat, you said. Mm-hmm. This is your 10th reason for supporting the war in Iraq. So you are getting ready for a war of civilizations.
Absolutely.
You are getting ready.
Better be ready for it.
But then you got to be ready for dictatorship in the United States. That's the problem.
No, I think not.
I think that's the problem.
Well, does this call on me at all?
You should talk, yeah. I think so.
All right, so I'm going to ask you to briefly...
I have a reputation for politesse now to uphold.
No, he should do it. No, it would be unfair if you could not.
Yeah, just going to ask you to quickly respond to each other, so maybe we can take a couple questions from the audience. So, Christopher.
Oh, well, I don't want to trespass on their time, but yes, I've had the sense for a long time, since approximately the time of the Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa against Salman Rushdie, when I began to take a serious interest in this, but sometime before. I've had the very strong and pervading sense that there is a clash of civilization impending, and probably that it's begun. And that the period I liked least was the time when they knew they were fighting it and we did not, which is the reason why I have to say I wasn't sure whether to feel ashamed or not, but I felt a vague but distinct sense of exultation on September the 11th. I thought, well, that period is over at any rate. And yes, I believe that it's enough to be at war and to recognize that we are, and to be training people to fight it harder and carry it to the enemy and press it home to victory. We are going to need the bitter experience of Iraq. Very soon, I would say the case I've nominated is Nigeria, where the forces of al-Qaeda and its allies are already working to bring about a civil war in another oil-rich, nearly failed, nearly rogue state. They're making great strides towards imposing a civil war on a country that's more or less evenly split between Islam and Christianity. There will be other target countries. Indonesia is clearly one. We're going to need all the ruthlessness we can acquire. We're going to need to be training really hard people. And I don't believe for one instant, I talked to these guys at West Point and elsewhere, they're the least bit interested in a dictatorship. They do what they do to defend democracy. There will always be times, in time of war, when the government tries to, as it were, to coin a phrase, take liberties, but we must be vigilant about that too, and there's no contradiction at all in that. I'm actually a plaintiff in the suit of the American Civil Liberties Union against the Justice Department and the National Security Agency on the wiretapping. And I can do that perfectly happily while supporting and trying to recruit support for what is a war that has been forced upon us. It's not escapable. It's not a war of choice, as some people have falsely told you. It was a war that was inevitable and in our future and was being brought to our very soil before we realized that this was the case. Saddam Hussein welcomed and greeted and sheltered the man who mixed the chemicals that blew up the World Trade Center in 1993. Nobody did anything. He paid no price for that. He tried to kill a former president of the United States on a visit to Kuwait, paid no price for it. Encouraged and cheered on people who committed all kinds of other atrocities, sheltered the people who were fleeing from Afghanistan, as did in many cases the Iranian government. Won by embassies blown up, war vessels attacked and torpedoed in ports we thought were friendly. No wake up, no wake up. People thought maybe if we don't think it's a war, there won't be one. Well, I think that that time has passed, and I have to say I'm glad of it. I like being at war, if you want to know the truth. These people must be defeated. They mean to take everything we've got, destroy everything we have, and wreck everything we care about. I'm for making a fight of it myself. And it's not just a duty to kill them, in some ways it's a pleasure, if you want really to know what I think.
Wait,
Hey, there you are. Sorry? Excuse me?
wait, Andrew responds, and then we'll take some questions.
What?
Well, I was
Would you like
responding
to
to him there.
respond?
Well, he was responding to me.
I was responding to him. He
and,
doesn't. That's a very brilliant encapsulation of it.
All right, now, the question from, I don't know how to possibly decide who's going to answer.
Colin, try to be brief, very brief, speak in a very loud voice. Maybe we can repeat the question briefly. There was one person that jumped first, but you first. Oh, do you want to go?
Two discussions came together in an interesting place. Professor Arato said, he asked a fundamental question, can foreign power be a liberating power? He didn't really answer it definitively. He said the original sin, if there was one, was the bombing of the Kurds. So he didn't really answer the question, he just left it down. Mr. Hitchens said, the original sin was what the United States did in 1968-69. Because of that, we now owe the Iraqis. But it's a problem. And that's this. You could be an articulate supporter of the war on the basis of the Hussein regime being a peaceful regime. This is what Mr. Hitchens has done to restore. The problem is to be gone from an articulate supporter of the war to someone who simply falsifies reality. Professor Arato didn't answer that question. I was posed it. I can answer it. There's a logic that Mr. Hitchens sets up as the following. You have what the United States does in 1968-69, which you try, with the same regime, the same logic that operated then operates now in terms of the American political regime. So it will continue to make the same mistakes, meaning it cannot prosecute the war you want without making all of the mistakes that it makes. In other words, the original sin, Professor Arato, is not whether a foreign power can liberate another country. The original sin is that a party like the Republican Party, which is a neo-fascist, neo-Confederate party, cannot ever be a liberating regime because its model of social order is the same one as the regime it's trying to defeat. That is the problem. And that's
well,
Boy, you get applause for that.
yeah, you are doing really well until the last sentence.
No, the last sentence was the whole point.
Yeah, well, but up till then it was a really interesting analysis, and then, you know, I hate Republicans really a lot, and I would do everything to get rid of them. Now, I think that the elections in November are so central. I think people really don't realize how important it is to get rid of him now. The Democratic Party is a shell of its former self, but I think we can put new life into it if we get rid of him now. But to call them fascist or neo-fascist, or to even say that they are explicitly trying to establish dictatorship, that's really, that's now, but here I think the serious point okay, so let me forget that part. The really serious point you're making, and I think this is a point that actually Paul Berman, who at some point was very close to you but now has some reservations, has also put almost the same way as the gentleman just did. Berman said basically I was always right, except that I was wrong about the agent. This agent could not have accomplished the thing that I expected it to accomplish back in 2002, because they don't believe in nation building, they don't really believe in democracy, They don't really, they have interests in the region which are selfish and which are tied up with very specific political and even sub-political interests. And so the mistake was to think that any agent could accomplish. And I think that.
No, that agent. And you put your finger on it when you said that Cheney and this regime went to war, not so much against Hussein, but against a certain kind of international order. That's the key to.
Well, I also think that's true. Yeah.
Let's take another question. You're in the middle. Yeah.
I agree with what Mr. Hitchens said in terms of this war, which is in a lot of ways cultural, but I disagree in the sense that it's something, and you didn't really say this, but you might have implied that it's newer than we think. I think it's something that's been going on for a long time. And I think a lot of it also, it's not one-sided. As I think you seem to think in the sense that it's really coming from the jihadist point of view. That is certainly one of the elements that's driving it. But I think a lot of it also is coming from the sense of certainly the Western side, where, for lack of a better term, the corporatocracy of certainly banks, major companies, and also governments, which have been part of the whole system all along. So in a lot of ways, I really think it's really part of this whole chess game that's been going on that is really part of world dominance. Who's going to actually dominate what world, and from what point of view you see as being where you think you're on the right or versus the other side that's on the wrong. And my question to you is that whether or not that isn't in fact what we're having going on right now.
Do you think we should take 2 or 3 questions? Because there's so many
Sure.
people that, and then each of you answer more or less the questions that you are. And you here. With those 3, we go.
Okay, leaving aside for one moment what whether or not this war is right or wrong, and looking at actually what has happened. When I look at how the Bush administration has executed this war, I think about a scene in movie All the President's Men where Woodward's talking to Deep Throat about the Nixon administration, and Deep Throat looks at him and goes, "The truth is, they're just not very smart." And I'm wondering, how did they butcher this war so poorly? How did they basically take a good idea, meaning get rid of a murderous dictator, and just completely screw it up? And no one seems to explain this, whether or not you can pinpoint one factor or another. And it's kind of going back to what Mr. Hitchens said when he was talking about, when he says, well, there's evidence, that Sarkar is trying to kill, enemies of Saddam. It's like, well, why aren't they shouting? Because I'm out there shouting for them, because they're too dumb to do it, or they can't communicate because they seemingly can't communicate anything. And I'm just wondering if anyone has an explanation for this.
My question actually relates to in part the answer to the previous question. I think that I would like to direct it to Christopher. It seems to me the only salient question at this point is what happens if the Iraq effort fails, and what's going wrong with it right now. And the most troubling article I read recently was the James Fallows piece in the Atlantic in December, which analyzed the lack of security and the decisions that were made to disband the army, difficulty in reconstituting it. And I wonder if you have any specific suggestions or projections about moving forward into the future to redeem the success of the operation. Since I share your view that it's necessary to force that from now on.
Fine.
So, either please start.
Well, this might sound.
We're going to have other questions after
Yeah,
that.
each time we get 3
Okay, got it.
questions.
All right,
Both of
good.
you answer
Okay.
more or less whatever.
I just want to know because,
To answer the last 2, if I can, together, you can't call it an original sin, but the great mistake was, strangely enough, having directed all this rhetoric at Iraq, or rather its regime and its leader, strange enough to underestimate how bad things were there. To underestimate how the sort of things I was talking about earlier, the complete atomization and shattering and maiming and traumatizing of society, the ruin of the human.
Sorry, I will. I'll go with him to the exit. Yeah, come back.
Is this coming out of my time? I'm never sure. The ruin of the Iraqi personality, if you like. just the abolition of any kind of solidarity or social bonding, and just the maiming and traumatizing 30 years of fascism and war. To underestimate the damage that had done, also to underestimate something even easier to measure, namely that there's nowhere to put a bandage on the oil industry. No investment had been made in it for years. There were people who knew how it worked. But it was like the Ankara telephone system used to be, or the Istanbul telephone system. Once the person who knew how it worked died, it didn't work anymore. That bad. I mean, the whole country needs to be redone. That's why I wish the international community had said to the president when he first proposed this, yes, we should all get together and discuss how much the World Bank's going to have to come up with, what to do about the oil fields, what to do about the devastation of the ecology, what to do about the slums and the underclass and the damage done by the sanctions, all of this. It's much, 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 much worse than we thought. Now, this is not intended as a consoling point, obviously, but it does invite you to think, I hope, of what Iraq would have been like if it had been let to rot and crash any further, if we waited to see what the implosion of the country and the society would have looked like.
That wasn't my question.
Well, no, but I mean, you see, yeah, well, I think it needs to be borne in mind every time. Because in a way, I'm not trying to have this both ways, but in a way, the chaos and misery and strain and sectarianism that you see in Iraq now is the proof of the need for regime change in the first place. Okay? Because picture what it would have been like unchanged. You'd have had to intervene under much worse, more Rwanda-like conditions later on. And in the meantime, the Turks and Saudis and Iranians would all have intervened on the side of their favorite clients or to establish their own interests. And there would have been a vortex, a black hole, which would have drawn in neighboring countries. The intervention came far too late in my point of view. The one point of convergence we've come up with this evening is everything would have been better in 1991. The militia types were weak then. Iran was quite weak because of the outcome of the recovery from the war. There was no one who could really have stopped. There were 500,000 American soldiers, furthermore coalition soldiers, within range of Baghdad. That's the argument for me begins with those who say that the decision to confirm Saddam that year was wrong. And neoconservatism, I should have put this in my answer to Stacy on that, begins as the faction that says that was a terrible mistake. That's the mistake we're paying for, not the attempt to rectify it in 2003. Do hope I make myself plain.
If I could just address the first question. I think that it's just a mistake to try to analyze these things in terms of very global theories when one really doesn't know why. You mentioned banks. I mean, I don't know why I would think that, Chase Manhattan or Citibank would be for or against this adventure or not. This is, we have to get out of that kind of, that way of talking about this thing. I think that the big globalization, which kind of comes to an end with this period of war and interventionism, was fine for American capital, and this period actually you see that other people, the Chinese, the Indians, are doing rather well. Latin America has become much more independent of American influence in this period. So the American empire or American capital as such, and I know these things are not always teleological. Sometimes you intend to do something and it works out badly, but I think they're not doing very well by the adventure. And I would not look for the causes in that particular area. I actually think that the logic of the American presidency, which Woodrow Wilson already discovered in constitutional government, namely to strengthen a weak political position by external adventure, is a better candidate in this case, a political logic, than this economic logic which you're thinking about. How did they screw it up? It's very hard to first of all estimate what the window of opportunity for doing it well was, assuming that you had Iraqi nationalism arrayed against you from the outset. But I think there is a window of opportunity. That window of opportunity assumes internationalization, assumes keeping the Iraqi state intact, assumes inclusive process of bargaining. Mr. Khalilzad, who's the first talented American viceroy there, He's an ambassador, but, you know, jokingly, I'm calling him Viceroy. I hope you don't think that that's what I think he is officially. He actually now promotes these kinds of things, but much, much too late. In fact, you know, I hate to praise Republicans, but Ms. Rice is a much more talented and much stronger Secretary of State than Mr. Powell was. And probably because of discrediting of the first phase of this operation, she has now taken charge of some of what is going on, And note that even now, and I'll just end with this, what's the point of, you know, talking too much. Even now, she's not fully in charge. Khalilzad, who's Rice's man now, I think there's no question about that, announced that they're going to negotiate with Iran over Iraqi issues. This is extremely interesting because initially it was announced that they will talk about regional matters and all kinds of things. And I think Rice and Khalilzad had in mind linking up various issues having to do with also Iran-American relations. It didn't have to be just Iran in Iraq and how to minimize a negative role for Iran among the militia and all the rest. Then I'm listening to a news conference held by Rumsfeld, and he's asked about this, and Rumsfeld says, "Oh, I'm not sure if that is even going to happen," and he's throwing, you know, a kind of negative light on it. And I said, "No, this guy just doesn't like it. It's obvious." And 3 days from that, then it is quashed. It's not happening. The time isn't propitious. So the inner battle, in fact, is again won on this particular issue by the other side. So, in fact, 2 things one can say about it. Either that one of the reasons why the American policy goes wrong is because it's two-headed, and there is constantly a battle between State Department and Pentagon forces, which of course also means the CIA on the State Department side and the Pentagon forces, which has its own intelligence agencies and the rest. Either it is two-headed, and that's why it is going wrong, or because ultimately the Pentagon team is still stronger with respect to the president through Cheney, and that's why it goes wrong. Those are 2 hypotheses. But I think that you can see this certainly as one factor, because when there's a very talented ambassador on the spot who's in fact finally trying to arrange an inclusive process which has a little bit of a chance, and I see this window, my window is by now extremely small, but still it is perhaps there, and they're still undercutting him in some fundamental ways. And that's what is going on. I mean, this is not a government that is actually operating through any kind of coherent leadership. What? It's a weak president who really will listen to one day and the other day. He's really a very poor leader. And with Powell, he would just listen to the Pentagon side basically and marginalize the State Department side. They had all kinds of plans, about 30 huge books about what to do in Iraq, including policing and all. They were just disregarded. But now he has a talented Secretary of State. I mean, she's very good, you know, and she handles the Europeans, for example, in a really talented way. I mean, you know, she has, contrary to what people might have expected, she has, my expectations, and in fact, I'm even against this, she has won the French and the Germans for Americans' Iran policy, at least for the moment. Now, how long it lasts, we don't know, but she is really doing a very talented job also in terms of that. I'm not for it, but I grudgingly have to admit that there's talent there. So now the policy has become really double-headed because there are the people on one side, there are people on the other side, and they're undercutting each other. Well, no wonder that Iraq is a mess because in fact, one side is in fact supporting the Shia, and the other side is now almost on the verge of having rebalanced things and supporting the Sunni insurrectionists, or at least a part of the Sunni insurrection through their political wing. Now that's strange when these people are shooting at each other and killing each other every day.
Yeah, I'm calling the 3. So.
And if I'm going to assume that, Mr. Hitchens, you believe that, and take you at your word, I was hoping to hear both of you speak of the idea, at least address the issue, that it is also it gives Mr. Hitchens, if you could in some way illuminate inside the mind of a neoconservative, because I don't know if you align yourself with them directly, but the idea of, you said that we have, through our sanctions, perhaps created this Rwandification, and now we're going in to fix that, this thing that we created. Okay, so we've created the scenario that we're going to now go in and fix. I mean, you kind of made that loop. You also said that unilateralism is something that if we could see that the French, if a veto is unilateral behavior, then you would say, okay, finally someone said that's unilateral, whereas we're only unilateral because we have the capability, which is, I think, in a way disingenuous, because unilateral is not only the capability, but choosing on your own terms to do something. So these are two arguments that I find that you have made that seem circular to me. So I'm wondering if you could illuminate in some way the logic that the neoconservatives have used, or the war planners have used, that is not circular and that is founded in something that is moral or real beyond this country's going down the toilet, although we made it go there. And so we're going to fix the thing that we created.
Gentlemen, I'm going to ask, we are over our time, so I'm going to ask you answer these questions and any concluding statements you want to say at the same time.
Goodness.
Sorry.
Well, I think it was Alfred Kazin reviewing someone or other, Lionel Trilling. No, Lionel Trilling reviewing Alfred Kazin says, who's this we you keep mentioning? It's an important point to bear in mind. Sometimes one has to say as a critic or a reviewer, we find ourselves, etc. So, well, be careful in this case. The record of past administrations, not including, as it happens, the Bush-Cheney one in Iraq, is something that is a responsibility, it seems to me, devolves upon the United States. Its citizens, its taxpayers, its Congress, its State Department, and so forth. And has to be discharged through whatever administration that might happen to be. I'll remind you that in 1998, on the initiative of the Clinton administration, the Senate and House passed the Iraq Liberation Act, in the case of the Senate without a single dissenting vote, saying it shall be the policy of the United States to change the government of Iraq and remove the government of Saddam Hussein. That was after quite a long debate on the merits of the case. It's a pity that the administration that proposed the act didn't enact it, but I can't help that, because I'm not part of that we. All I am is a voice in this debate, and you can hear what I say and challenge me on it. So I think I evade nothing by saying that. As to the question of which two of you asked, was about, well, can one take them seriously? Look, the best thing the Bolshevik Party ever did, in my opinion, was to publish the secret treaties that the Tsarist government had signed. When it broke open the Tsarist foreign ministry, they published the treaties that all the Allies had secretly agreed to during the First World War, including, most importantly, the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France to carve up Syria, Iraq, and Palestine after the war. This made it quite impossible for Woodrow Wilson to say that American help for Britain and France was not a participation in an imperialist war. It made him look stupid. It clearly was an imperialist war, and had been from the beginning, as anyone could have seen. Well, but Mr. Wilson, pious hypocrite though he was, had to come up with something. Came up with the 14 points instead, as a justification for later establishing the League of Nations and establishing the principle of self-determination. Did he really believe it? I'd have to be him to know. But if the Bush administration says, or the Clinton administration says, our foreign policy is incompatible with the existence of Saddam Hussein or any other totalitarian regime, whether they believe it or not, it's a standard to which I think one should try and hold them. They've made a statement that's become the property of the meeting. Don't let them take it back. If they're not going to be consistent about it, let's point it out to them. If they're going to be incompetent or hesitant, we are not spectators or consumers only. We are citizens, voters, and taxpayers. Remember, as I keep saying to you, the responsibility for all this is yours too. Don't keep asking me, what are you doing about this? What have you done lately to help a single person in Iraq? Any of you? Think about that. You should have been thinking about it before. Don't keep whining on about incompetence. There are things you can be doing and encouraging others to do. You're not a consumer, you're not a spectator, and some of you are not that good as critics, if you honestly want my opinion. though I'm sure you could improve with practice.
Well, I think that among the various motives that go into the construction of this war, that what you point to, the gentleman over here, is one. Now, I cannot say that it is the president who himself is actually understands this Wilsonian idea that a preemptive presidency, in the words of Stephen Skarvenek, is a weak presidency, exhausted already ideologically, because the Reagan Revolution is already pretty far back, and besides, at that time, he not only doesn't have a mandate, but he didn't even win the popular vote. He's not doing very well. Bin Laden rescues him. He is very high in the polls. Crisis clearly increases the power of the president. And I think if I just want to put a symbolic name on this, but I cannot put an actual person because I don't know, I'm not privy to the decision-making processes, I would put the name Karl Rove behind this idea. I don't think Karl Rove missed the fact that a war in Iraq timed in the right way, and he talked about marketing, when you market it, when you throw the new idea in, would be very helpful, at least for the congressional elections which would come up in the following fall. So I think it is part of it. But I cannot say myself in good conscience that it is the only part. Other things are going on. Christopher here strongly believes in the rightness of it. I think from everything I heard, Tony Blair believed in it as well, because otherwise it is inexplicable that he threw away such a powerful position in English politics for the sake of a loser, because in English politics he gained really nothing thereby. So people can actually believe in this thing, and the neoconservatives to some extent did believe in it. So that's the only way one can handle it. But I have no doubt. Or perhaps, let's put it this way, I would like to pose a strong hypothesis that the element that you're talking about played a role, and it is significant. The other gentleman's point, I think, is quite right. I mean, America's role in the world is significant, and it's part of what we're talking about. I hope that this issue would come up earlier, and I wouldn't mind if because if I challenge you, you should be able to respond. One of the things that your side in this debate always says, when my side points out that America's role in the world has something to do with 9/11, and something to do with terrorism and all the rest, is that we're blaming the victim. That the act of terror is the responsibility of terrorists themselves. The terrorists are the cause of terrorism. And I think, theoretically speaking, one has to be able to distinguish between cause and justification. Just because the only people who have responsibility in relationship to the attack on the World Trade Center or any other terrorist act, the terrorists themselves, does not mean that in the order of empirical facts, they're the only cause of it. And in this sense, someone like Chalmers Johnson, who describes the blowback phenomenon before it actually happens, and I think many of you have read his work, empirically predicts it and is right. America's actions in the world are producing blowback phenomena, and in this case, Bin Laden has explained clearly enough. Now they say, well, he hates our way, he hates our freedoms, he wants to take it away, he wants to do this, but the fact is that basically he's interested in what we're doing there, and that's what he's responding to. And I'm not saying that would be a sufficient reason to withdraw from the region or not to do anything there. But I think we have to take into account that unleashing new wars in the region is going to produce ever new blowback phenomena. You say you enjoy the idea of killing terrorists, but do you enjoy the idea of producing new terrorists? Because that's the question that is equally significant. You know, are you producing them at a quicker rate than you're killing them? You're not really killing a hell of
Well,
a
you
lot.
might as well come right out and say it, that the cause of terrorism is the resistance to it. That's about as far as your syllogism goes.
No, I actually haven't said that. I distinguish between.
I think I heard you
distinguish
say
between cause
more
and
or less
responsibility,
exactly that.
and I don't think you understood the philosophical
Well,
distinction.
when you say that, whatever it comes from, if fighting it only produces it, then I think you more or less have circularized your syllogism.
I don't think you understood the
Well,
philosophical
now,
distinction.
let me also add something. Mr. Bin Laden's group begins as an attempt to detach Kashmir from India. He wants the destruction of India, and as far as he can, he proclaims the destruction of the Hindu religion. It's quite a major democratic ally of ours. I think worth fighting on their side against that kind of gangsterism. He wanted the Philippine government to surrender a large part of its territory so as to have a separate Muslim state in the Philippines. He wants East Timor given back to Indonesia. Do you want me to go on with this? What change in your policy, what change in our policy do you think would please this man?
Not a question of pleasing
And are you
him.
interested in doing so?
No.
Excuse me.
No. The point
Oh,
is.
you don't have to come, you don't have to come, Buster, and you can go anytime you
No,
like.
the point is to choose a policy which is both effective and doesn't produce more terrorists. And it so happens that Afghanistan.
How do you avoid the blowback from Kashmir?
No.
Tell me, just give that one example.
Let's talk about 9/11 and its aftermath. The American invasion of Afghanistan was a just war. Was not only right in relationship to the phenomena that occurred, namely that an actual state was protecting terrorists, but also established a baseline for states in the future, because if you support terrorists in that way in the future, we will attack you. That was a very, very fundamental baseline to establish. So what do we do next? We attack a state that hasn't done that has not harbored terrorists, which means we take away the very same deterrence. We will attack you either way now. So this means that there is no reason, there's no reason for the neeks state not to harbor anybody, because we'll attack them. If they're dictatorships, we'll attack them one way or the other.
All over New York, the weeks after the destruction of the World Trade Center and its workers, when the operation to get Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was being meditated, I heard, you all heard it. People said, if you kill Osama bin Laden, 1,000 will spring up in his place. Who did not hear that then? That's the fatalism of your logic.
Well, you should have come to the teaching at the new school.
I don't say you said it, but I'm saying you might as well.
I strongly argued for doing this in the sense of establishing a deterrent. I spoke like Wolfowitz on that particular subject.
How do you know you're not summoning people to his banner in Afghanistan now? There's strong evidence that the Taliban is reviving.
But not by that.
The recruits are coming in from Pakistan to join it. Why don't we surrender now and get the whole thing over with?
Not allowing enough
otherwise we'll only be
international troops
pissing
in
these
there.
people off.
By attacking Iraq, taking away American forces from Afghanistan.
No, there's a surplus of forces.
And by not allowing international troops into Afghanistan when they were still offered, because now no one is offering them.
Afghanistan is a NATO responsibility now. Now, let's come to this question about Iraq and terrorism, because I've got to say this. Mr. Yassin, the man who mixed the chemicals for the World Trade Center in 1993, an Iraqi, is taken into custody by our wonderful FBI and let go because he seems like such a cooperative witness. Amazing. But these are the people who've been protecting us all along, and the CIA as well. When the only American able to infiltrate the Taliban was John Walker Lind of Marin County. That's what you get for a multi-trillion-dollar CIA budget. All right, they let him go. He goes to New York Airport, he gets on a plane, he's next seen in Baghdad. Baghdad, as I can tell you, is not a city under Saddam Hussein you can enter or leave at will. You try it, even if you're an Iraqi. Can't be done. Someone has to want you there.
All right.
He's protected by them ever since. The man who killed Leon Klinghoffer when captured was traveling on an Iraqi diplomatic passport. Abu Nidal, who I met in Baghdad, was an arm of the Ba'ath Party's foreign ministry. He wasn't a man hiding out in Iraq. He was a man working as part of the Iraqi state. The whole of the Iraqi system was a network for saboteurs and nihilists, and it was beginning to welcome the people who were trickling out of Afghanistan, most notably Mr. Zarqawi. You, any of you, are President of the United States. You say, shall we give this regime the benefit of the doubt? Why not give Saddam the presumption of innocence? That would work. Remember who you'll have to face if you're wrong. Remember what you have to live with if you're wrong.
I'm
Yeah,
afraid,
the mushroom cloud.
No
but
responsible person could have taken that risk.
gentlemen,
the mushroom cloud, I think that on
I
that
didn't say
particular
mushroom
note, I think we should end because, again, you know, you insist on putting us in a science fiction world.
all right.
I appeal to the fair-mindedness of the audience. Everything I've said, everything I've just said can be verified by anyone with a search engine.
Can I say something, Dr.
And much more besides, by the way.
So I want to thank everybody. Maybe because I'm from Argentina, because Christopher Hitchens is from the UK and Andrew Arato from Hungary. I don't think that this discussion should be necessarily totally civil. I think nastiness is part of such a absolutely relevant issue of our time. So thanks for being here at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in Los Angeles discussing these matters. Thanks.